The history of the ancient kingdom of Eldoria, a land now forgotten by time and obscured by the relentless march of progress, begins in the misty epochs before recorded history, where the first settlers, a dour and unremarkable people, eked out a meager existence in the damp and unyielding soil of the river valleys, their lives dictated by the slow turning of the seasons and the occasional flooding of the Eldor River, which provided both sustenance and destruction in equal measure, as the early Eldorians, lacking any significant technological advancements, relied entirely on the whims of nature for their survival, their days filled with the tedious labor of tilling fields, mending crude tools, and constructing simple wattle and daub huts that offered little protection against the harsh winters that swept down from the northern mountains, where the snow lingered well into the spring and the winds carried the faint echoes of distant wolves, a sound that haunted the dreams of the Eldorian children, who were raised on stories of the great frost giants said to dwell in those peaks, though no one had ever seen such creatures, and the tales were likely invented to keep the young from wandering too far into the woods, where the dense undergrowth and the tangled roots of ancient oaks made navigation nearly impossible for those unfamiliar with the land, which was itself a patchwork of minor tribal territories, each ruled by a petty chieftain who claimed descent from one of the mythical founders of Eldoria, though these genealogies were dubious at best and often fabricated to legitimize the shaky authority of these minor lords, whose disputes over grazing rights and fishing spots frequently escalated into dull and protracted conflicts that rarely resulted in any meaningful change, as the warriors of Eldoria were armed with little more than bronze-tipped spears and leather shields, making battles slow and exhausting affairs where the victor was often determined not by skill but by which side grew tired first, and the dead were buried in unmarked graves along the riverbanks, the names forgotten within a generation, their deeds unrecorded except in the vague oral traditions passed down by the village elders, who themselves could scarcely remember the details of events that had occurred more than a few decades prior, leaving the true history of early Eldoria shrouded in a fog of half-remembered myths and tedious agricultural cycles, as the people, neither particularly brave nor innovative, continued their unchanging routines for centuries, their lives a monotonous repetition of planting, harvesting, and waiting for the next inevitable disaster, be it flood, famine, or the occasional raid by neighboring tribes, who were themselves no more remarkable than the Eldorians, merely slightly better at stealing grain or cattle, though these raids were so infrequent and inconsequential that they barely warranted mention in the grand tapestry of history, which, for Eldoria, was little more than a dull, beige fabric woven from threads of boredom and stagnation, a land where nothing of note happened for generation after generation, the people living and dying without leaving so much as a footnote in the annals of the wider world, their existence a whisper in the wind, a fleeting shadow on the edge of history's vision, soon to be swallowed by the encroaching darkness of time's relentless passage. Chapter 2. As the centuries trudged onward with the sluggish pace of a river clogged with silt, the kingdom of Eldoria entered what historians would later call the epoch of mild significance, a period in which absolutely nothing of true importance occurred, yet the Eldorians, in their characteristic delusion of grandeur, believed themselves to be on the cusp of a golden age, a belief fueled by the ascension of King Ormond the Unremarkable, a ruler whose sole claim to distinction was his ability to sit on a wooden throne for an impressive 37 years without ever issuing a decree that anyone remembered, his reign defined by an unbroken series of council meetings where minor disputes over sheep ownership and the proper distribution of mead during festivals were debated at length before being tabled indefinitely, as the Eldorian nobility, a group of men so devoid of charisma that even their own servants struggled to recall the names, preferred inaction to decisive leadership, allowing the kingdom to drift like an unattended barge down the slow-moving Eldor River, while the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, continued their ceaseless toil in the fields, their backs bent under the weight of grain sacks that never seemed to lighten no matter how many hours they labored beneath the pale, indifferent sun, their lives punctuated only by the occasional religious festival honoring the god Thalric, a deity of harvests and stagnation, whose priests delivered sermons so dull that attendees often fell asleep standing up, their dreams filled with visions of endless ploughing and the rhythmic thud of mortar and pestle grinding barley into flour, a sound that had become the unofficial anthem of Eldoria, a kingdom where even the birds seemed to sing in a monotone, their chirps blending into the background noise of creaking cartwheels and the distant, half-hearted clanging of the royal blacksmith, who had not forged a sword in years due to the lack of wars and whose primary occupation now was mending the same set of kitchen knives for the castle cooks, who themselves prepared meals so bland that they were said to sap the will to life from anyone who consumed them, a fact that did little to deter the Eldorians, who accepted their joyless existence with the same resignation as they did the annual flooding of their fields, an event that had long since ceased to surprise anyone and was now met with the same enthusiasm as the changing of the chamber pots in the royal quarters, a task performed by a perpetually sighing servant whose name no one knew and whose face no one recognized, for such was the fate of those born into obscurity in a land where history itself seemed to be dozing. Chapter 3. The 3rd century of Eldoria's existence brought with it a development so minor that it barely warranted documentation: the introduction of a slightly improved plough, a tool that differed from its predecessor only in the angle of its blade, a modification so insignificant that the farmers who used it could not discern any difference in their crop yields, yet the royal chroniclers, desperate for something to record, hailed it as a marvel of innovation, dedicating an entire scroll to its description, a scroll that was promptly stored in the royal archives and forgotten within a week, joining countless other documents detailing equally forgettable events, such as the day a cow wandered into the palace courtyard and was mistaken for an envoy from a neighboring tribe, leading to an awkward hour of attempted diplomacy before the error was discovered, or the time when a minor nobleman, Lord Edric of the Hollow Hills, attempted to institute a tax on the gathering of mushrooms, a proposal that was met with such apathy that even the tax collectors forgot to enforce it, leaving the peasants to continue their fungal foraging undisturbed, as they had for generations, their baskets filled with the same unremarkable varieties of mushrooms that had sustained their ancestors, none of which were particularly flavorful or nutritious, but which served as a passable addition to the otherwise dreary Eldorian diet, a diet that consisted primarily of boiled grains, salted fish of questionable freshness, and a type of bread so dense that it was rumored to have once been used as a building material during the construction of the Western Granary, a building that had stood for 200 years without incident until a single, listless breeze caused one of its walls to collapse, an event that was met with neither alarm nor urgency, as the Eldorians simply piled the stones back into place and continued storing the grain in it, despite the fact that the roof now sagged at an angle that suggested imminent collapse, a fact that no one seemed to mind, for such was the Eldorian way, accepting decay as inevitable and inconvenience as a fact of life, much like the slow encroachment of moss upon the castle walls, a process so gradual that it went unnoticed until the day a visiting diplomat from a neighboring kingdom remarked upon it, only to be met with blank stares from the Eldorian courtiers, who had long since ceased to see the moss, just as they had ceased to see the cracks in the throne room floor or the way the tapestries had faded into indistinct blobs of color, their once vivid scenes of mythical battles now reduced to vague smudges that might as well have depicted anything, or nothing at all. Chapter 4. By the time Eldoria reached its 400th year, the kingdom had settled into a rhythm so predictable that even the changing of the seasons seemed redundant, each year unfolding in the same tedious sequence of ploughing, planting, harvesting, and waiting for winter, a cycle that had long since drained any sense of anticipation from the populace, who now regarded even the most minor deviations from routine with suspicion, as demonstrated when a traveling minstrel arrived in the capital and attempted to sing a ballad about a heroic knight, only to be met with yawns and requests for older, more familiar songs, preferably ones with no discernible melody or lyrics that spoke of crop rotations and the proper storage of root vegetables, topics that the Eldorians found far more engaging than tales of adventure, which they dismissed as frivolous nonsense unbecoming of a serious people, a people who prided themselves on their ability to discuss the weather for hours without ever arriving at a conclusion, their conversations meandering like the Eldor River itself, looping back on themselves until even the original topic was forgotten, much like the fate of the Royal Library, a collection of scrolls that had been left to moulder in a damp cellar after the last literate nobleman died without an heir, leaving the kingdom without a single person who could decipher the elaborate script in which Eldoria's laws were written. Not that it mattered, as the laws had not been updated in living memory and mostly pertained to the correct way to stack firewood and the penalties for allowing one's goats to graze on another man's pasture, offences so rarely prosecuted that the magistrates had taken to napping through their court sessions, waking only to dismiss each case with a wave of their hand and a mumbled injunction to settle it among yourselves, a phrase that had become the unofficial motto of Eldorian justice, much to the relief of the populace, who preferred to handle their disputes through prolonged glaring and the occasional passive-aggressive remark muttered just loud enough to be overheard but not so loud as to require a response, a system that worked well enough in a society where genuine conflict was as rare as a sunny day in Eldoria's perpetually overcast skies that seemed to press down upon the land like a damp woolen blanket, smothering any spark of excitement before it could catch flame, leaving the kingdom in a state of perpetual drowsiness, as if the entire land were on the verge of nodding off but never quite managed to do so. Chapter 5. The 5th century of Eldoria's existence dawned with all the fanfare of a damp candle failing to ignite, as the kingdom's inhabitants, now thoroughly accustomed to the unchanging nature of their lives, greeted the new era with the same enthusiasm they reserved for the weekly inspection of the granary's rat traps, an event so routine that even the rats had learned to ignore it, continuing their slow but steady consumption of the kingdom's grain reserves without fear of interruption, much like the royal family, whose lineage had grown so intertwined through generations of strategic marriages between cousins that they now all bore the same slack-jawed expression and tendency to forget their own titles mid-sentence, a trait that had done little to endear them to the populace but had at least spared Eldoria the turmoil of succession crises, as no one could muster the energy to dispute the crown's inheritance when it passed, as it always did, to the eldest surviving relative, regardless of their fitness to rule, a system that had resulted in a series of monarchs so indistinguishable from one another that the court historians had taken to referring to them collectively as the Grey Kings, a term that applied equally to their personalities, their wardrobes, and the pallor of their skin, which had taken on a vaguely mushroom-like hue from decades spent indoors, listening to reports about crop yields and the ongoing debate over whether the kingdom's single bridge needed repairs, a debate that had been ongoing for 70 years and showed no signs of resolution, as the Eldorian Council could not agree on whether the bridge was worth fixing, given that no one had used it since the old trade route had been abandoned in favor of a slightly shorter path that bypassed the river entirely, leaving the bridge to slowly crumble into the water below, its stones disappearing one by one into the murky depths, where they joined the remnants of other forgotten structures, all of them swallowed by the same indifferent current that had carried away Eldoria's few fleeting moments of significance, leaving behind only the silt of time and the quiet, unrelenting march of days that blurred together into an indistinguishable mass, like porridge left to cool and congeal into a single, unappetizing lump. Chapter 6. As Eldoria entered its 6th century, the kingdom's chroniclers, a group of men who had long since given up any pretense of enthusiasm for their work, dutifully recorded the year's most noteworthy event, the death of a centenarian shepherd named Hrold the Uncomplaining, a man whose sole claim to fame was that he had never once expressed an opinion on anything in his entire life, a trait that had earned him the respect of his fellow Eldorians, who saw in his silent endurance the ideal to which all should aspire, and so his passing was marked with a funeral procession that stretched nearly halfway across the village square before petering out due to lack of interest, the mourners dispersing to resume the daily chores with the same blank-faced determination that had carried them through previous generations, their lives as unchanging as the stones in the fields they tilled, stones that seemed to multiply each year no matter how many were cleared away, as if the earth itself were conspiring to make their labor harder, though none of the farmers dared voice this suspicion aloud, for to do so would require energy they did not possess and might invite the attention of the local magistrate, who had recently decreed that all complaints must be submitted in writing, a rule that effectively silenced the populace, as no one could remember how to hold a quill, let alone spell the words required to articulate the grievances. Not that they had any grievances worth mentioning, for Eldoria had reached a state of such perfect equilibrium that even dissatisfaction had become a rarity, the people having long since accepted that their lives would consist of the same handful of tasks repeated until death, a prospect that did not trouble them, for they had also accepted that death would be as uneventful as their lives, marked by a simple burial in one of the many overcrowded graveyards that dotted the countryside, the names quickly forgotten, the graves soon overgrown with the same hardy weeds that thrived in Eldoria's nutrient-poor soil, weeds that were, in their own way, the kingdom's most successful inhabitants, outlasting kings, outliving dynasties, and enduring long after the last Eldorian had breathed their last, sighing breath, leaving behind only the faintest of echoes in the annals of history, a whisper lost in the vast, yawning silence of time. Chapter 7. The 7th century in Eldoria began with a meteorological event so underwhelming that even the most dedicated of the royal weather scribes, a position held by a man named Hrold who had not missed a day of recording cloud patterns in 43 years, struggled to describe it with any enthusiasm, as it consisted of a light drizzle that persisted for exactly 3 days and then ceased without fanfare, leaving the ground slightly damp but not enough to delay the annual inspection of the kingdom's sole remaining granary, a task that fell to the newly appointed Minister of Grain, a man whose sole qualification for the role was his ability to stand perfectly still for hours at a time, a skill he had honed during his previous occupation as a scarecrow in the western barley fields, a job he had performed with such dedication that the crows had long since learned to ignore him entirely, just as the Eldorian populace had learned to ignore the slow decay of their institutions, a decay that had progressed to the point where the royal treasury was now housed in a cracked clay pot that had once held pickled herring, its contents consisting of 3 copper coins and a button of uncertain origin, a collection that represented the entirety of Eldoria's wealth, not that anyone seemed to mind, as the concept of currency had largely fallen out of use in favor of a system of barter so convoluted that even the participants could not explain it, relying instead on a shared sense of resignation that made precise accounting unnecessary, a sentiment that extended to every aspect of Eldorian life, where the boundaries between work and rest, between day and night, between one year and the next, had blurred into a seamless haze of half-completed tasks and abandoned resolutions, like the time the village elders had resolved to repair the well and had managed to lower a bucket into it before becoming distracted by a debate over whether the water had always tasted faintly of mushrooms or if this was a new development, a debate that had continued intermittently for 7 years without resolution, much like the kingdom itself, which persisted not through any particular virtue or strength but simply because no one had mustered the energy to disband it, leaving it to linger like the smell of damp wool in an unventilated room, unnoticed by those who had grown accustomed to it but faintly oppressive all the same. Chapter 8. By the 8th century, the Eldorian royal family had become so inbred that they communicated primarily in a series of grunts and eyebrow raises, a language so subtle that even the courtiers who had served them for decades could only guess at their meaning, leading to a series of increasingly bizarre proclamations that no one dared question, such as the day King Faldric the dimly remembered declared that all turnips were to be referred to as honorable tubers, and given a place of honor at the high table, a decree that was obeyed without comment, as the Eldorians had long since learned that it was easier to humor their rulers than to attempt reasoning with them, just as it was easier to step around the potholes in the road than to fill them in, a practice that had resulted in a network of footpaths so meandering that visitors often became lost within minutes of entering the capital, wandering in circles until they either collapsed from exhaustion or simply gave up and settled into the rhythm of Eldorian life, a fate that had befallen more than one would-be conqueror, their armies dissolving into the populace like salt in a tepid broth, their weapons repurposed as farming tools or, more often, left to rust in the rain, as the Eldorians had no use for swords in a land where the greatest threat was the occasional aggressive goose that had to be shooed away from the vegetable patches, a task that fell to the children of the kingdom, who performed it with the same lack of enthusiasm they brought to all their chores, the games as joyless as their labor, consisting mainly of sitting in silence and seeing who could stare at the ground the longest, a pastime that had produced a generation of Eldorians with exceptionally strong neck muscles from the constant downward gaze, a trait that served them well in the daily lives, where looking up was rarely necessary and often resulted in nothing more than a view of the same grey sky that had hung over Eldoria for centuries, a sky so featureless that it had inspired exactly 0 poems, despite the best efforts of the royal bard, a man who had once attempted to compose an ode to the clouds but had fallen asleep midway through the second stanza and had not been heard from since. Chapter 9. The 9th century saw the rise of what later historians would call the Great Stagnation, though to call it a rise was something of a misnomer, as it was in fact a period of such profound inertia that even the worms in the Eldorian soil moved slower than usual, their sluggish progress mirroring that of the kingdom's economy, which had dwindled to the point where the most valuable commodity was the gossip passed between the washerwomen as they beat the dirt out of tunics that had not been truly clean in living memory, their conversations revolving around the same handful of topics: the relentless dullness of the weather, the questionable parentage of the royal family's latest offspring, and the ongoing mystery of who had stolen old Marta's favorite spoon 3 decades prior, a crime that remained unsolved largely because no one cared enough to investigate, though it was still brought up at every gathering as a form of ritual small talk, a tradition that had outlasted the spoon itself, which had long since been melted down for scrap metal, not that anyone had noticed its absence, as Eldorian cutlery was so poorly made that one spoon was virtually indistinguishable from another, much like the days, which blended together so seamlessly that the concept of weekends had been abandoned centuries ago, replaced by a system where every day was a workday unless it rained, in which case it was also a workday but slightly damper, a distinction that mattered little to the peasants, who toiled regardless of the weather, their lives a monotony broken only by the occasional birth or death, events that were marked with the same level of ceremony as the mending of a particularly stubborn hole in a sock, a task that could take weeks to complete given the Eldorians' lack of sewing skill and general apathy toward clothing repairs, resulting in a population that was perpetually clad in garments that were more patched than original fabric, their outfits a physical manifestation of the kingdom itself, a patchwork of barely held together traditions and compromises that somehow continued to function despite having outlived the usefulness centuries ago. Chapter 10. As Eldoria entered its 10th century, the kingdom's foremost philosopher, a man named Yorick, who had once spent an entire year contemplating a single blade of grass before concluding that it was probably green, published his magnum opus, a treatise titled On the Nature of Boredom and Its Many Subtle Variations, a work so dense and devoid of insight that it was hailed as a masterpiece, largely because no one had the stamina to read past the first page, though this did not stop the royal court from declaring it the foundation of Eldorian thought, a designation that meant absolutely nothing in practice but allowed the nobility to feel as though they had contributed something to the kingdom's cultural development, a delusion they clung to even as the rest of Eldoria continued its slow decline into obscurity, a decline marked by such non-events as the day the last literate person in the kingdom died without passing on their skill, rendering the entire population functionally illiterate overnight, though the impact of this loss was minimal, as the Eldorians had never been great readers to begin with, preferring instead to spend their evenings sitting in silence and watching the fire burn down to embers, a pastime that required no mental exertion and could be enjoyed by even the dimmest members of society, a category that included most of the royal family, whose bloodline had grown so thin that the current heir to the throne, a boy known only as Prince What's His Name, was said to have the cognitive abilities of a particularly slow-witted sheep, a comparison that did a disservice to the sheep, which at least had the sense to move out of the rain, unlike the prince, who had once been found standing in a downpour for 3 hours because no one had told him to come inside, an incident that would have been tragic if anyone had cared enough to feel sorry for him, but as it was, the courtiers simply shrugged and went back to their naps, leaving the prince to drip dry on his own, much like the kingdom itself, which by this point was less a functioning state and more a collection of damp people waiting for something to happen, though if pressed, none of them could have said what that something might be, as their imaginations had atrophied to the point where even the concept of change was foreign to them, leaving them to while away the centuries in the same way they whiled away the hours, by doing nothing at all and calling it tradition. Chapter 11. The 11th century dawned with all the excitement of a rusted hinge slowly giving way, as Eldoria's population dwindled to the point where the annual census could be conducted by a single man with a bad memory and a piece of chalk, his tally mark scrawled on the side of the royal granary, which was still standing, though no one could remember why, forming a sad testament to the kingdom's decline, though decline was perhaps too strong a word, as it implied that there had once been a height from which to fall, whereas Eldoria had always been more of a gentle slope into mediocrity, a slope that had now reached its natural endpoint, a kingdom where the rats outnumbered the people and the only sound louder than the occasional cough was the relentless dripping of the palace's leaky roof, a sound that had become so ingrained in the Eldorian consciousness that it was said to have influenced the rhythm of their music, if the listless tapping of a spoon against a porridge bowl could be called music, which the Eldorians did, having long since forgotten what real instruments sounded like, their last lute having been repurposed as a doorstop decades ago, its strings snapped one by one over the years until nothing remained but a vaguely musical-shaped piece of wood that no one had the heart to throw away, much like the kingdom itself, which persisted out of sheer inertia, its laws unenforced, its borders unguarded, its people uninterested in anything beyond the next meal, which was always the same as the last, a thin gruel flavored with whatever weeds had not yet gone extinct in the kingdom's overgrazed fields, a meal that sustained life without ever making it worth living, a fact that troubled no one, as the Eldorians had reached a state of such profound contentment with their lot that they no longer even sighed when they woke up in the morning, instead greeting each new day with the same blank stare they gave the setting sun, their lives a perfect circle of meaningless routine, unbroken by joy or sorrow, untouched by time or progress, as immutable and unchanging as the stones in the fields, which would outlast them all. Table, let me know. Chapter 12. The 12th century arrived in Eldoria with all the fanfare of a damp rag being dropped onto a dirt floor, its passing marked only by the slow accumulation of dust in the corners of the royal archives where the kingdom's records were kept, or rather, where they had once been kept before the last archivist had given up his post some 60 years prior to become a hermit in the western marshes, leaving the scrolls to slowly fuse together into a single, unreadable mass of mildew and insect casings that no one had bothered to examine, much less preserve, as the Eldorians had long since abandoned any pretense of caring about their own history, preferring instead to focus on the more immediate concerns of determining whether the latest batch of ale had fermented properly, it hadn't, and debating whether the strange rash spreading through the village was plague or merely an unusually persistent case of eczema. Consensus leaned toward the latter, though no one could be bothered to consult a physician, assuming one could be found who hadn't yet drunk himself into oblivion. The royal court, such as it was, had dwindled to 3 elderly nobles who spent the days dozing in the throne room, waking only to argue about which of them had the right to sit on the crumbling dais that had once been a proper throne before termites had reduced it to something resembling a large, vaguely chair-shaped sponge, while the so-called army consisted of a single toothless guardsman who spent his days chasing children away from the abandoned barracks with a broom, his shouts echoing through streets that grew quieter with each passing year as more and more of the population either died off or wandered away in search of places where the concept of flavor had not been forgotten entirely, leaving behind empty cotters that sagged under the weight of their own indifference, their thatched roofs slowly surrendering to the elements like the kingdom itself, which persisted not through any particular virtue or strength but simply because no one had mustered the energy to officially declare it dead. Chapter 13. By the 13th century, Eldoria had achieved a state of such perfect equilibrium with its own decline that even the passage of time seemed to have slowed to a crawl within its borders, the days stretching out like the endless fields of half-dead barley that still somehow managed to produce just enough grain to keep the remaining populace from starving outright, though no one could say whether this was due to agricultural skill or simply because the plants themselves were too apathetic to die properly. The royal family, now reduced to a single inbred descendant whose most notable feature was his ability to sleep with his eyes open, had taken to holding court in the castle's former wine cellar after the main hall ceiling collapsed during an unusually vigorous rainstorm, the proceedings consisting mainly of long silences punctuated by the occasional request for someone to scratch the king's back where he couldn't reach, a duty that rotated among the handful of remaining courtiers who hadn't yet succumbed to the general malaise or been pressed into service as scarecrows in the increasingly futile attempt to keep what few crops remained from being devoured by the now bolder than ever crows, who had taken to strutting through the village square with the confidence of conquerors, their course serving as the closest thing Eldoria had to a national anthem. Trade with neighboring kingdoms, never robust to begin with, had ceased entirely after the last merchant caravan got lost on its way to Eldoria and decided to settle in a nearby valley instead, leaving the kingdom to subsist on what little it could produce itself, mostly a thin, greyish gruel that tasted vaguely of disappointment and which the Eldorians consumed without complaint, having long since forgotten that food could be anything other than a means to delay death for another day, their taste buds having atrophied from generations of bland subsistence, much like their imaginations had withered from lack of use, leaving them perfectly adapted to their slowly crumbling world, where nothing ever changed except the steady accumulation of cobwebs in the corners of their lives. Chapter 14. The 14th century saw Eldoria reach what future scholars would later identify as the post-society phase of its existence, a period in which all the trappings of civilization remained technically present but had ceased to serve any meaningful function, like a clock whose gears had rusted solid but which no one had bothered to remove from the wall. The kingdom's laws, last updated some 400 years prior, still technically forbade the wearing of purple on Tuesdays and mandated that all goats be licensed by the crown, though no living person could recall why these ordinances had been enacted or where one might obtain the mythical goat licenses, assuming anyone cared enough to try. The position of royal tax collector still existed on paper, though the last person to hold the office had died generations ago while waiting for someone to actually produce taxes for him to collect, his skeleton still seated at a small desk in what had once been the treasury, now just another piece of furniture in a castle that was more ruin than residence, its halls echoing with the sounds of pigeons nesting in the rafters and the occasional, half-hearted attempt by the remaining servants to sweep away the worst of the debris, though even this minimal effort had largely been abandoned after someone realized the dust would simply return tomorrow and no one would notice either way. The few remaining Eldorians went about the daily routines with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, their actions dictated by habits so ancient that their origins had been lost to time, like the ritual of touching the lucky stone in the village square every morning, a practice that continued even after the stone had crumbled into gravel, the villagers now simply touching the empty space where it had once been before shuffling off to another day of tasks that served no purpose other than to fill the hours between sunrise and sunset, their lives reduced to a series of motions performed without thought or expectation, like the slow turning of a water wheel long after the stream that powered it had dried up. Chapter 15. As the 15th century dawned over Eldoria, or rather, as the sun rose on yet another grey morning indistinguishable from the thousands that had preceded it, the kingdom achieved what might be considered its crowning philosophical achievement, the complete eradication of ambition from its collective consciousness. The concept of progress had become so foreign that when a travelling tinkerer happened upon the village and demonstrated a slightly improved design for a cooking pot, the assembled Eldorians stared at him in blank incomprehension before returning to their ancient, leaky vessels, unable to fathom why anyone would bother changing something that had worked well enough for their ancestors, and their ancestors before them, even if worked well enough meant losing half the broth to seepage and requiring constant adjustment to prevent tipping over. The royal archives, now just a damp corner of what remained of the castle's basement, contained exactly one still legible document, a grocery list from 2 centuries prior that someone had mistaken for a treaty and carefully preserved accordingly, its profound banality making it perhaps the most authentically Eldorian artifact in existence. The few children born in recent years learned to walk and talk at a significantly delayed pace, as if the very air of Eldoria had become thick with inertia, the development mirroring that of the kingdom itself, which continued to exist in the same way that a shadow continues to exist even when no one is looking at it, as a passive, ephemeral thing with no substance of its own, a mere afterimage of what had once been, though in truth Eldoria had never been much to begin with, its entire history amounting to little more than a prolonged sigh in the face of existence, a collective shrug in the form of a civilization. Chapter 16. When the 16th century finally stumbled into Eldoria like a latecomer to a party that had ended generations ago, the kingdom had reached a state of such sublime irrelevance that even the crows had begun to lose interest, their numbers dwindling along with the human population until only a single, particularly stubborn bird remained, its daily flights between the abandoned watchtower and the crumbling granary serving as the closest thing the land had to a functioning economy. The last official census, conducted more out of habit than necessity, revealed that the entire population could now be comfortably seated around a single large table, assuming anyone could muster the energy to drag the chairs together, which they couldn't, so instead they simply stood in loose clusters, counting themselves by muttering numbers under their breath until someone lost track and they all agreed that "close enough" was probably accurate for government work. The concept of seasons had blurred into a single, eternal lukewarm autumn, the trees neither fully alive nor completely dead, their half-hearted attempts at producing leaves mirroring the half-hearted attempts of the remaining Eldorians at producing anything resembling culture or innovation, the greatest achievement in recent memory being the rediscovery of fire, which they promptly forgot about again when the cook who had managed to spark a flame died before passing on the technique. The kingdom's borders, once marked by proud stone pillars carved with the royal crest, had faded into the landscape so completely that travelers could pass through without ever realizing they'd entered a sovereign nation, assuming they came at all, which they rarely did, leaving Eldoria to its quiet, unobserved dissolution, like a sugar cube dissolving in a cup of tea that no one would ever drink, its sweetness wasted on empty air. Chapter 17. The 17th century settled over Eldoria like a damp woolen blanket left to mildew in a forgotten cupboard, its arrival unmarked by ceremony or even casual acknowledgement from the dwindling populace who had long since stopped tracking the passage of years, preferring instead to measure time in the gradual lengthening of beards and the slow accumulation of rust on the few remaining tools that hadn't yet been repurposed as doorstops or firewood. The royal palace, now more a termite condominium than a seat of power, had developed a distinct lean to the east that no one had bothered to correct, partly because the remaining nobles were too frail to notice and partly because the angle provided a slight advantage when spitting out the windows, which had become the primary pastime of the court during their increasingly infrequent gatherings. The kingdom's sole remaining law, an ancient edict forbidding the whistling of jaunty tunes on pain of death, had not been enforced in living memory, though this was less due to progressive reform and more because no one could recall how to whistle, or indeed what constituted a jaunty tune, the very concept of music having faded into myth alongside other forgotten arts like blacksmithing and basic hygiene. The village square, once the bustling heart of civic life, now served mainly as a repository for broken pottery and the occasional napping elder, its cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic that had dwindled to the occasional shuffle of a lone villager moving between their home and the communal well, the waters of which had taken on a faintly metallic taste that no one found worth mentioning, let alone investigating. Chapter 18. By the 18th century, Eldoria had perfected the art of existing without actually being asterisk. Its social structures eroded to the point where the distinction between ruler and subject had dissolved entirely, leaving the nominal king, a man whose name even he struggled to remember, to spend his days wandering the castle grounds in a moth-eaten robe, pausing occasionally to hold imaginary conversations with statues that had crumbled to dust generations prior. The economy, if it could be called that, now operated on a system of vague gestures and tired sighs, transactions conducted with all the enthusiasm of a man handing off a dead fish to someone who didn't particularly want it either. The last surviving merchant had given up trying to sell his wares years ago and now simply sat in the hollowed-out stump of what had once been the marketplace, staring at a single cracked bowl that no one would ever buy, his inventory reduced by time and indifference to this one sad artifact of a time when commerce had still been a concept people pretended to understand. The fields, untended for decades, had reverted to a state of semi-wilderness, the barley stalks now competing with hardy weeds for dominance in soil so exhausted it could barely sustain life at all, though the few remaining Eldorians didn't seem to mind, having adjusted the diets to accommodate the increasing scarcity by simply eating less, then less again, until the very idea of a full meal seemed like a fairy tale told to children who no longer existed. The kingdom's archives, now reduced to a single waterlogged page stuck to the bottom of an ale barrel, contained only a fragment of a sentence that might have once been important but was now just a smear of ink that vaguely resembled the word turnip, a fitting epitaph for a civilization that had never aspired to anything greater than not dying quite yet. Chapter 19. The 19th century arrived in Eldoria without fanfare, much like a tardy guest slipping into a party after the hosts had already gone to bed, its presence noted only by the slow, inevitable creep of ivy up the sides of buildings that hadn't been entered in years. The Royal Council, which hadn't convened since an unfortunate incident involving a misplaced gavel and a nap that lasted 17 years, was now just a collection of empty chairs arranged around a table so warped by damp that it resembled a small topographic model of the kingdom's long-forgotten mountain ranges. The military, once a proud, if underutilized, force, had disbanded after the last soldier retired to become a part-time scarecrow and full-time melancholic, his uniform repurposed as a nest for mice who showed more discipline than their human predecessors had in centuries. The legal system had devolved to a single, unwritten rule: don't bother anyone, and no one will bother you, a principle upheld with such devotion that disputes were now settled by all parties involved wandering away mid-argument and pretending the disagreement had never happened. The arts had fared no better. The last known attempt at creative expression had been a mud dauber's nest that vaguely resembled the late Queen's profile, a masterpiece that went unappreciated until the rains came and returned it to the earth from whence it came. Even the weather seemed to have lost interest in Eldoria, the skies perpetually overcast but never storming, the air so still that a dropped spoon could be heard from 3 houses away, not that anyone would bother to pick it up. Chapter 20. As the 20th century dawned, or more accurately, as the sun rose on yet another in a millennia-long series of indistinguishable mornings, Eldoria achieved a state of such perfect equilibrium with entropy that it became difficult to tell where the kingdom ended and the natural world began. The last remaining citizen, though citizen was too strong a word for a man who hadn't spoken aloud in decades, divided his time between staring at the horizon and attempting to remember whether he had ever had a family, a question that grew less pressing with each passing season until it faded entirely, like the letters on a weathered tombstone. The castle, now just a vaguely geometric arrangement of mossy stones, had become home to a colony of exceptionally apathetic badgers who mirrored the kingdom's founding principles by doing absolutely nothing unless compelled by hunger, and even then only after a suitable period of contemplation. The roads, once trodden by merchants and messengers, had vanished beneath the carpet of creeping time and apathy, their roots preserved only in the fractured memories of people who no longer existed. The great works of Eldoria, its laws, its treaties, its half-hearted attempts at poetry, had all returned to the earth, their parchment pages digested by worms who derived no more nourishment from them than the original readers had. Even time itself seemed to have given up on the place, the days bleeding together into a seamless continuum of mild discomfort and negligible change, a fitting end for a civilization that had never really tried to begin with. Chapter 21. When the 21st century finally trickled into Eldoria like water seeping into a cracked basin, there was no one left to notice. The wind stirred the leaves of a particularly persistent oak that had taken root in the throne room, its branches stretching toward the hole in the ceiling where the rafters had long since surrendered to rot. Somewhere in the overgrown village square, a rusted weathervane creaked out a tune no one would ever hear, its slow revolutions marking days that no one would ever count. The kingdom's legacy, what little there was of it, had dissolved into the soil along with the last fragments of pottery, the last scraps of cloth, the last bones of the last Eldorian, who had lain down in a sunlit patch of grass one afternoon and simply forgotten to get back up. In the end, there was no grand finale, no dramatic collapse, just a slow fading away so gradual that even the birds failed to remark upon it. The borders of Eldoria, once painstakingly marked with stone and decree, had blurred into the surrounding wilderness until not even a whisper remained to tell the world it had ever existed at all. And so history, with its usual indifference, moved on, leaving behind only the faintest of impressions, like a footprint in dust that the next breeze would erase without a trace. Chapter 22. The 22nd century found Eldoria in a state that defied conventional definitions of existence, like a candle that had burned down to the stub yet somehow refused to gutter out, its flame reduced to a faint blue whisper of heat that served no practical purpose but couldn't quite manage the dignity of extinction. The last standing structure, a single wall of the granary that had somehow outlasted the rest of civilization through sheer obstinacy, now functioned as a windbreak for a colony of exceptionally listless hedgehogs who had perfected the art of sleeping through entire seasons. The concept of government had dissolved so completely that even the pretense of monarchy was gone, the last royal insignia having been repurposed as a chew toy by a fox with questionable taste in relics. The weather, as if out of respect for Eldoria's commitment to mediocrity, had settled into a perpetual autumn that never quite tipped into winter, the trees shedding leaves at a rate precisely calculated to maintain a carpet of decaying foliage without ever achieving the aesthetic appeal of true decay. Occasionally, a traveler would stumble upon the remains of the kingdom, usually by tripping over a moss-covered milestone engraved with the word, "Beware," the rest of the inscription lost to erosion, but these interlopers rarely stayed long, driven away by the overwhelming sense that they were intruding on a place that had already finished dying but hadn't gotten around to lying down yet. Chapter 23. By the 23rd century, Eldoria's primary export was irrelevance, its cultural influence limited to a single folk tale in a neighboring village about the place where nothing happens twice, a story told primarily to induce drowsiness in restless children. The kingdom's last surviving artifact, a wooden spoon claimed by 3 separate museums before scholars realized it was just a stick whittled by boredom, had been misplaced in a storage cellar and promptly forgotten, a fate that would have pleased the original Eldorians, who had always preferred oblivion to scrutiny. The river, once the lifeblood of the realm, had shifted its course centuries ago in what historians would later call the most effort anyone had ever expended to avoid Eldoria, leaving behind a meandering scar of damp earth where frogs now held councils to debate the meaning of rainfall. Time itself seemed to move differently here, with entire decades passing between the fall of one acorn and the next, the seasons blurring into a haze of lukewarm afternoons and nights so still they seemed to hold their breath. Even the worms moved slower here, their tunnels forming labyrinthine patterns that archaeologists would one day misinterpret as ritual earthworks, rather than the aimless doodles of invertebrates as listless as the humans who had once lived above them. Chapter 24. The 24th century witnessed Eldoria's most significant event in 600 years, the collapse of the last standing wall, which toppled during an unusually vigorous breeze with all the ceremony of a sigh escaping a sleeping man. The resulting dust cloud, more of a polite cough than a true upheaval, settled over the remains of the castle like a shroud woven from indifference. Nearby, a single wild apple tree, likely grown from a cord tossed aside by some long-dead peasant, finally bore fruit for the first time, only to have the apples rot untouched on the branch, their fermentation producing a vinegar so weak even the flies refused to drink it. The kingdom's final census, conducted by a badger who had taken up residence in the ruins of the treasury, counted exactly 0 humans, 3 ghosts, all of whom were too bored to horn properly, and an indeterminate number of beetles who had inherited the earth with all the enthusiasm of a clerk stamping paperwork. The sole remaining law, an unspoken understanding that nothing should ever change, was upheld with such devotion that even the weeds grew in the exact same patterns year after year, their roots clinging to the sterile soil like fingers refusing to release a coin no one wanted anymore. Chapter 25. As the 25th century dawned, implies a level of drama entirely foreign to Eldoria. The kingdom achieved its long-sought apotheosis, it became indistinguishable from the landscape. The last carved stone, once part of a monument to some forgotten bureaucrat, had been worn smooth by rain until it resembled any other rock in the field. The cellar holes of cotters filled with rainwater and tadpoles who would grow up believing ponds were supposed to be rectangular. Even the name, Eldoria, faded from regional maps, replaced by the cartographer's notation, unremarkable scrubland, a description so accurate it hurt. The kingdom's legacy lived on only in the form of a regional idiom. Eldorian ambition, meaning, the act of giving up before you've begun, and in the peculiar behavior of crows nesting near the site, who had developed a habit of dropping pebbles into empty spaces and waiting for a sound that never came, as if expecting the earth itself to finally acknowledge what had been lost. But the earth, like history itself, had moved on, leaving behind only the faintest of impressions, a slight depression where the castle had stood, a few pottery shards that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, and the lingering sense that something might have happened here once, though it probably hadn't been worth remembering anyway. Chapter 26. The 26th century settled over the ruins of Eldoria like a layer of dust on an already forgotten bookshelf. The wild apple tree, now an old elder of the landscape, dropped its annual crop of inedible fruit with the same lack of enthusiasm the last Eldorian had once reserved for paying taxes. A family of stoats took up residence in the hollow where the castle's cellar had been, their playful skirmishes constituting the most exciting events the land had witnessed in 300 years. Occasionally, a particularly dense patch of mushrooms would sprout in geometric patterns where buildings had once stood, a phenomenon that would have delighted the kingdom's long-vanished scholars, had any survived to misinterpret it as evidence of ceremonial earthworks, rather than the predictable result of decaying floor joists. The seasons continued their slow procession, though winter had grown noticeably milder, as if even the climate couldn't be bothered to commit to proper snowfall over terrain this devoid of significance. Chapter 27. By the 27th century, the wandering sheep of neighboring regions had established well-trodden paths through the ruins, their hooves inadvertently performing the archaeological work no human cared to attempt. The oldest ram, a beast with one crooked horn and the resigned expression of a creature that had seen too much of life's disappointments, became the de facto ruler of the territory by virtue of being the only organism present with enough energy to occasionally headbutt saplings. The kingdom's last standing artifact, a single iron hinge from the granary door, finally succumbed to rust, its dissolution marking the end of Eldoria's metallic age with considerably less fanfare than its Bronze Age collapse had warranted. Meanwhile, the Badgers, now in their 12th generation of uninterrupted occupancy, began expanding their tunnels into what remained of the royal wine cellar, their occasional drunken stagger being the closest approximation of courtly behavior the land had seen in living memory. Chapter 28. The 28th century introduced a minor ecological shift when a particularly tenacious strain of lichen began colonizing the remaining stonework. This grey-green growth spread with all the ambition Eldoria had famously lacked, eventually forming patchy approximations of the kingdom's original borders, a development that would have thrilled nationalist historians, had any existed to witness it. The apple tree, now more dead than alive, produced a final crop of 3 withered fruits that hung from its branches like forgotten Christmas ornaments until a particularly peckish crow took one taste and immediately regurgitated it, thus concluding Eldoria's agricultural legacy. Around this time, a landslide in the northern hills, the most dramatic geological event in the region's recorded history, quietly buried the last fragment of carved masonry bearing the royal crest, though the worms who now inhabited the soil beneath it reported no noticeable change in their quality of life. Chapter 29. As the 29th century dawned, the last physical evidence of Eldorian civilization vanished beneath a blanket of wild thyme and creeping buttercups. The Badgers, after centuries of dutiful occupation, abandoned their tunnels for reasons that remain unclear, possibly due to declining property values, or more likely because a particularly juicy earthworm migration had been spotted near the river's new course. The sheep paths grew fainter as flocks found better grazing elsewhere, until even the stoats departed in search of prey that hadn't already learned to play dead. The land itself seemed to exhale slowly, settling into its post-human existence with the relief of a bench finally freed from the weight of a particularly boring conversationalist. Only the crows remained, their nests occasionally decorated with shiny pebbles that might, if one squinted, have once been part of something greater, though the birds themselves had long since stopped wondering about their origin. Chapter 30. The 30th century found the site in a state of perfect ecological equilibrium. The apple tree's skeleton had been reclaimed by ivy, forming a natural arch that field mice used for clandestine weddings. The underground streams that had once fed the castle well now surfaced in a clear pool where dragonflies performed their iridescent courtship rituals entirely unobserved. At night, the wind through the grasses sometimes produced a sound that, if one listened with generous imagination, might resemble the echo of a long-forgotten folk tune, though this was likely just the auditory pareidolia of anyone foolish enough to linger too long in a place that had so thoroughly embraced oblivion. And yet, in the way that light persists as photons long after its source has died, some spectral impression of Eldoria remained, not a haunting, not a memory, but the quiet certainty that somewhere, somehow, a kingdom had once committed the extraordinary feat of being completely, utterly, magnificently average right up until the moment it wasn't anything at all. Chapter 31. The 31st century dawned upon the former Eldoria with the same indifferent grace as a stone settling deeper into mud. The ivy-choked apple tree arch finally collapsed during an unusually still night, its decay so gradual that not even the field mice noticed until their wedding venue had become a slightly elevated mound of vegetable matter. The dragonflies, unaware they were the most dynamic creatures to inhabit the area in 900 years, continued the shimmering patrols over the spring-fed pool, which had by now developed a reputation among migratory birds as that occaish puddle near the weird lichen patch. Underground, the last remnants of Eldoria's foundations continued their slow metamorphosis into geology, the occasional iron nail or pottery shard dissolving at a rate that would make continental drift seem positively hasty by comparison. A team of hyper-specialized archaeologists from a distant university briefly considered investigating the site before unanimously deciding to study something more interesting instead, like the dietary habits of Bronze Age mollusks. Chapter 32. By the 32nd century, the spring had widened enough to swallow the last visible traces of the castle cellar, its waters turning an opaque green that somehow managed to be neither inviting nor threatening, the perfect aquatic reflection of Eldoria's enduring legacy. The lichen, having exhausted all available stone, began growing in slow, concentric circles on nearby tree trunks, creating patterns that a particularly imaginative botanist might have described as nature's attempt at bureaucratic paperwork. The crows, now several generations removed from having seen so much as a button to steal, took to decorating their nests with particularly shiny acorn caps instead, their ancestral memory of human habitation reduced to an instinctive attraction to objects that served no practical purpose, a fitting tribute to the kingdom's aesthetic sensibilities. Meanwhile, deep in the subsoil, the last recognizable fragment of Eldorian pottery, a 2 square centimeters scrap of a child's bowl decorated with what might have been a duck or possibly just an unfortunate glaze accident, finally crumbled into mineral components, its molecules dispersing with the quiet dignity of a civil servant retiring after 50 years of filing unimportant documents. Chapter 33. The 33rd century witnessed the most dramatic event in Eldoria's post-history when a lightning strike ignited the meadow where the village square had once been. The fire burned with all the enthusiasm of a man reluctantly agreeing to second helpings at a mediocre banquet, consuming 3/4 of an acre before being extinguished by a rain shower that couldn't quite be bothered to become a proper storm. In the ashes, a peculiar phenomenon occurred. The heat caused the last surviving slivers of buried glass to fuse into tiny, misshapen beads that migrating songbirds occasionally mistook for seeds. This ecological misinformation campaign represented Eldoria's first export in over a millennium, albeit one that provided no nutritional value to anyone involved. The following spring, the scorched earth gave rise to an unusually vibrant crop of fireweed, its purple blooms constituting the most colorful spectacle the land had seen since the last marginally competent court jester had died in 1472. The display went unwitnessed by human eyes, though a disinterested hedgehog did pause to nibble on a stem before deciding it wasn't worth the effort. Chapter 34. As the 34th century unfolded, the spring's expansion created a small wetland that attracted a pair of mating herons. The closest thing to royalty the site had hosted in living memory. Their nest, constructed from twigs and the occasional scrap of rusted metal that still leached iron oxides into the water, stood as a precarious monument to repurposed resources. The male heron's attempts to impress his mate with catches of particularly large tadpoles went unappreciated by anyone except the tadpoles themselves, who would have registered protest if they weren't busy not being frogs yet. Meanwhile, in the subsoil, chemical processes too slow to measure transformed the last iron implements into thin veins of oxide that future geologists would misinterpret as evidence of possible pre-industrial metallurgical activity, before crossing the site off their research lists for being insufficiently publishable. Above ground, the wind through the reeds occasionally produced sounds that, in a more fanciful world, might have been mistaken for the ghostly echoes of long-forgotten arguments about sheep grazing rights. Chapter 35. The 35th century found the land in a state of such perfect natural rehabilitation that even the most determined ecologist would have struggled to prove humans had ever lived there. The heron's descendants still visited the now established wetland, though they'd long since exhausted the local food supply and only returned out of habit. The lichen, having achieved total coverage of all available surfaces, began growing on itself in layers that would eventually form a peculiar sedimentary record of atmospheric conditions over the past 300 years, a dataset no one would ever analyze. The last physical reminder of Eldoria's existence was now a single molecular signature, a slightly elevated lead concentration in the northeast quadrant soil that corresponded exactly to where the royal privy had once stood. This final testament to human presence was so insignificant that not even the earthworms found it noteworthy, though they'd always avoided the area anyway, their primitive nervous systems somehow retaining the ancestral memory that this particular patch of dirt had always been exceptionally boring. Chapter 36. The 36th century settled over the former Eldoria with the quiet determination of a geological epoch that had long since stopped keeping track of human calendars, the land now so thoroughly reclaimed by nature that even the most dedicated historian would have struggled to pinpoint where the kingdom's borders had once lain, the last remnants of its stone walls having dissolved into the soil like sugar in Entropy, leaving behind only faint mineral traces that no instrument could reliably distinguish from ordinary bedrock, while the spring-fed wetland had expanded into a shallow marsh that attracted not just herons but the occasional disoriented moose who wandered through on its way to more interesting places, their massive footprints creating temporary ponds that lasted just long enough for mosquito larvae to mature before drying up again in the summer heat, a cycle of minor ecological drama that played out unseen by any intelligent observers unless one counted the crows who occasionally paused to drink from these muddy depressions before continuing on their way with the air of creatures who had seen more compelling sights elsewhere, their nests now entirely devoid of human artifacts unless one considered a particularly smooth piece of quartz an artifact, which most archaeologists decidedly did not, and even the lichen had begun to die back in places where the tree canopy had grown too dense, their intricate patterns fading like forgotten ink on parchment as the centuries of uninterrupted forest growth marched steadily onward, the oak and ash trees that had taken root in the ruins of the castle now mature enough to drop thousands of acorns and samaras each autumn, none of which sprouted in quite the right conditions to replace their parents, resulting in a slow but inevitable shift toward beach dominance that would take another 4 centuries to complete, not that anyone was keeping track, and beneath it all the last molecules of what had once been a thriving, if unremarkable, human settlement continued their slow migration downward through the soil column at a rate measured in millimeters per millennium, their eventual fate to be compressed into sedimentary rock layers that would only be exposed when some distant future mountain range rose up millions of years hence, at which point any remaining traces of Eldoria would be so thoroughly scrambled with the detritus of other civilizations as to be utterly unrecognizable, a prospect that would have horrified more ambitious cultures but which suited Eldoria's legacy perfectly, its disappearance as gradual and unprotesting as its entire history had been, the land now quieter than it had been in millennia, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional plop of a frog entering water, a tranquility so complete that even the ghosts had given up on haunting centuries ago, their whispers fading into the background noise of photosynthesis and decay like the last notes of a song no one had particularly enjoyed in the first place. Chapter 37. By the 37th century the marsh had become a proper peat bog, its acidic waters preserving oak leaves and dragonfly wings with the same casual efficiency it might once have preserved a sacrificed king had Eldoria ever produced either sacrifices or memorable monarchs, which it hadn't. The anaerobic conditions below the waterline slowing decomposition to such a degree that a dropped acorn from 30 generations prior could still be identified if one had the patience to sift through meters of partially decayed vegetation looking for such things, which no one did. The nearest humans now living far enough away that their folk tales only vaguely referenced that place where mushrooms grow funny sometimes, a description so accurate it barely qualified as legend, while overhead the shifting climate patterns had brought slightly wetter summers that encouraged the growth of a particular moss species that only thrived in areas with consistent moisture and minimal disturbance, conditions the former Eldorian heartland provided in abundance, its centuries of uninterrupted quiet having created the perfect environment for organisms that valued predictability over excitement, the moss spreading across fallen logs and stone remnants alike in thick green blankets that muffled sound even further, giving the forest an eerie hush that travelers instinctively avoided without quite knowing why, as if some primal memory recognized this as a place where ambitions went to die quietly, and indeed the few animal trails that wound through the area all showed evidence of being routes of transit rather than residence, the local fauna preferring to bed down elsewhere even when passing through, their subconscious avoidance creating a subtle but noticeable gap in the usual density of woodland creatures, a void that went unremarked upon by the occasional graduate student conducting wildlife surveys but which would have fascinated the long-vanished Eldorians had they possessed the curiosity to study such things, which they hadn't, the collective attention span having been barely sufficient to track the annual progress of their crops, let alone the complex interplay of species in an old-growth forest, and so the land continued its slow transformation into something entirely new, the last whispers of human habitation now so faint that even the trees no longer remembered having been selectively harvested for building materials, the growth rings showing no signs of the careful coppicing that had once shaped this landscape, the forest having rewritten its own history with the quiet determination of an author discreetly editing out an unimportant subplot, the very soil beneath it now holding less archaeological promise than a random patch of wilderness 50 miles away, the atoms that had once composed Eldorian tools and bones and dreams now so thoroughly scattered and recombined as to be functionally immortal yet utterly anonymous, their origins untraceable even in principle, their stories lost to all but the patient minerals that had witnessed everything and said nothing. Chapter 38. The 38th century witnessed a minor climatic shift that brought slightly cooler temperatures to the region, causing the peat bog to expand another 12 meters southward and swallow what had once been the foundation stones of Eldoria's granary, the acidic water working patiently to dissolve minerals that had resisted a millennium of mere weather, the crystalline structures unraveling at a pace that made continental drift seem positively hasty by comparison, while overhead the forest canopy had grown dense enough to discourage undergrowth in all but the sunniest clearings, creating a cathedral-like gloom where sound traveled strangely and the air smelled perpetually of damp humus and unfinished decomposition, an environment that suited the remaining fauna just fine, the resident population of salamanders and wood frogs having evolved slightly darker pigmentation over the centuries to better blend in with the shadowy leaf litter, their evolutionary journey being the closest thing to ambition the land had witnessed since the last Eldorian tax collector had given up waiting for someone to pay taxes, and even the migratory birds that passed through twice yearly did so with minimal fuss, their stopovers brief and businesslike compared to the exuberant congregations that gathered in more hospitable wetlands, as if the very air of the place discouraged lingering, a theory supported by the complete absence of invasive plant species that had colonized every other part of the region with weed-like enthusiasm, the former Eldorian territory remaining stubbornly pristine in its floral composition for reasons that baffled botanists but which local folklore attributed to the old ones being picky about the gardening, a superstition that would have amused the historically real Eldorians had they ever considered themselves worthy of posthumous spiritual significance, which they hadn't, the collective self-esteem having hovered somewhere between modestly disinterested and actively opposed to grandeur, and so the centuries rolled on with neither fanfare nor witness, the land's transformation so gradual that even the trees couldn't agree on when exactly the character of the forest had changed, The growth rings telling conflicting stories of wet years and dry years that all blurred together in the grand scheme of things, the very concept of Eldoria, now reduced to a handful of barely detectable chemical anomalies in soil core samples that no graduate student would ever bother writing a thesis about, their academic careers being better served by studying literally anything else, leaving the kingdom's final dissolution to occur without ceremony or documentation, its passing quieter than the fall of a single leaf in an uninhabited forest, its legacy measured in the absence of legacy, its history written in the unread language of pollen grains and sediment layers, its memory kept only by the patient stones that had never cared about human affairs in the first place. Chapter 39. As the 39th century unfolded, the peat bog's expansion slowed to a near halt as the water table found equilibrium with the surrounding watershed, its surface now a perfect mirror for the overhanging trees except during the brief period each autumn when it became choked with falling leaves that sank without a trace within days, the bog's tannin-rich waters preserving them in a state of near-perfect suspension just below the surface where they formed a dense layer of organic matter that would one day become lignite if given enough time and pressure, resources the land had in abundance, the weight of centuries pressing down with geological patience as the climate continued its slow oscillations between warm and cool phases that affected tree growth rates in ways only dendrochronologists could appreciate, not that any was studying this particular patch of forest, their attention being focused on more dramatic locations where the tree rings told stories of volcanic eruptions and medieval droughts rather than the quiet saga of uninterrupted mediocrity that characterized this site. And even the wildlife had settled into routines so predictable they barely qualified as behaviors, the resident population of frogs emerging each spring within the same 3-day window they had for generations, their mating calls lacking the variety and vigor of more vibrant ecosystems, their tadpoles developing at precisely the average rate for their species without any of the frantic competition seen in more crowded ponds, the entire food chain proceeding with the listless efficiency of a bureaucratic process that had long since lost its original purpose but which continued out of institutional inertia, while underground the last iron nails from Eldoria's vanished buildings had oxidized completely into reddish streaks in the subsoil that vaguely followed the lines of where walls had once stood, their patterns visible only in core samples that no one would ever take, their significance understandable only to a hypothetical archaeologist with both infinite patience and shockingly low standards for research topics, and even the annual wildflower bloom that painted the forest floor each spring had settled into the same predictable sequence of species year after year, the yellow trout lilies always giving way to white trilliums which were in turn replaced by the purple geraniums in a cycle so reliable it could have been set to a calendar had anyone been keeping track, which they weren't, the land's utter lack of remarkable features having finally achieved its perfect apotheosis as a place so ordinary it defied description, its history reduced to footnotes in footnotes, its geography indistinguishable from 1,000 other patches of woodland, its very existence hovering on the edge of ontological uncertainty like a dream forgotten upon waking. Chapter 40. The 40th century arrived without ceremony, the forest continuing its slow transformation as the dominant tree species shifted almost imperceptibly toward beech as the older oaks reached the end of the natural lifespans and fell without witnesses, their massive trunks becoming nurse logs for the next generation of seedlings in a cycle as old as forests themselves, the peat bog having by now stabilized at exactly 2.7 hectares according to satellite surveys that no human eye would ever scrutinize for signs of historical significance, its dark waters reflecting the sky with such perfect clarity that on windless days it became impossible to tell where reality ended and reflection began, a metaphor so heavy-handed that even the crows would have avoided it had they been capable of abstract thought, their own existence having settled into routines so unchanging that the genetic diversity had begun to decline slightly according to theoretical models no ornithologist would ever bother running for this particular population, while beneath the surface the last traces of Eldoria's material culture had completed their transformation into geological features indistinguishable from natural mineral deposits, their human origins now untraceable by any means short of divine intervention, and even the local microclimate had developed peculiarities that set it slightly apart from the surrounding region, the air over the former castle grounds being consistently 0.4 degrees cooler than nearby areas due to some quirk of vegetation density and groundwater flow that no graduate student would ever dedicate their thesis to studying, the sum total of Eldoria's legacy now measurable only in these infinitesimal deviations from baseline wilderness, its entire civilization reduced to a statistical anomaly in environmental data sets that would be discarded as noise, its kings and peasants alike forgotten even by the land that had borne them, the names lost to time, their deeds, such as they were, erased from memory, their existence fading into the same oblivion that claims all things given sufficient time, the universe itself being remarkably efficient at recycling mediocrity, the atoms that had once composed Eldorian homes and tools and bones now scattered across the biosphere in forms so mundane they defied poetry, the journey from kingdom to cosmos complete. Their story ended not with a bang or a whimper but with the quiet sigh of equilibrium finally achieved, the wheel of time having turned full circle to arrive exactly where it began, nowhere in particular. Chapter 41. The 41st century settled upon the former lands of Eldoria like a blanket of fog so thick it forgot to lift for decades, the air itself growing heavy with the accumulated exhalations of 10,000 generations of earthworms processing the last physical remnants of what had once been a kingdom into the sort of rich, loamy soil that would have made the original inhabitants weep with agricultural envy had they possessed the emotional capacity for such displays, which historical records suggest they decidedly did not. The peat bog having by now achieved maximum capacity and begun the slow process of turning its deepest layers into the precursors of coal that would require another few 100,000 years of pressure to become anything remotely useful to industrial civilization. Not that anyone would be around to exploit it by that point. The water's surface now home to a peculiar species of carnivorous plant that had drifted northward as the climate warmed, its tiny bladder traps sucking in unsuspecting mosquito larvae with the same lack of fanfare that had characterized all significant events in this region since time immemorial, while overhead the beech trees had finally achieved full dominance over their oak predecessors, their smooth grey bark completely unmarked by the initials or declarations of love that more accessible forests accumulated, their branches swaying in winds that carried no echoes of human laughter or lament, the very concept of seasons having become so entrenched and predictable that even the squirrels could set their internal clocks by the mass production cycles, their hoarding behaviors now perfected to the point where they buried exactly 2.3% more nuts than they could possibly need, a margin so conservative it would have made Eldoria's legendary tight-fisted treasurer nod in approval, had his bones not long since dissolved into the water table to become part of the calcium deposits that occasionally form strange, skeletal patterns on submerged rocks during particularly dry summers, patterns that no living creature interpreted as omens or portents because the local wildlife had long since learned that nothing interesting ever happened here, a lesson the land itself seemed determined to reinforce through increasingly elaborate demonstrations of mundanity, from the way morning dew collected in perfectly identical droplets on every leaf to the mathematically average lifespan of every resident spider, the entire ecosystem having settled into a rhythm so precise it bordered on the tedious, the sort of natural harmony that would have driven romantic poets to drink out of sheer desperation for something to write about. Chapter 42. By the 42nd century the forest had become so dense that sunlight reached the forest floor for exactly 17 minutes per day at the summer solstice, creating conditions ideal for a particular shade-loving fungus that spread across the ground in intricate fractal patterns resembling the street plans of long-dead cities, a coincidence that would have delighted conspiracy theorists had any ever stumbled upon this utterly forgettable patch of woodland. The fungal networks beneath the soil now so extensive that they formed what mycologists would call a superorganism, if they could be bothered to take samples from such an undistinguished location, their mycelial threads occasionally encountering the last iron particles from Eldoria's vanished tools and absorbing them in a process so slow it made continental drift seem positively sprightly by comparison, the metal ions traveling through the fungal highways at a rate of roughly 1 centimeter per century before being deposited in distant mushroom caps that deer would eat and subsequently forget about, the entire cycle representing nature's most lackluster alchemical transformation, while overhead the branches had grown so intertwined that they formed a nearly continuous canopy that muted all sound, giving the forest an eerie quietude that discouraged even the most adventurous hikers from venturing too deep into its confines, their subconscious minds picking up on some quality of the air that whispered, "Turn back," in a voice indistinguishable from their own thoughts. The land's reputation for being unsettling in a very boring way, having become firmly entrenched in regional folklore as generations of parents warned their children not to play near that place where nothing happens twice, a caution that was entirely unnecessary as no child in living memory had ever expressed interest in visiting what was essentially just a slightly dimmer version of every other patch of woods in the region, the only marginally distinctive feature being a single glacial erratic that had been deposited during the last ice age and which now served as the sole geological landmark in an otherwise featureless terrain, its north face covered in lichens that grew at precisely the median rate for their species, its south face slightly warmer by an average of 0.2 degrees Celsius according to thermal imaging no one would ever bother reviewing. The sum total of Eldoria's legacy now reduced to this, a rock that was marginally less interesting than its surroundings, a fitting monument to a civilization that had elevated mediocrity to an art form. Chapter 43. The 43rd century witnessed the most dramatic ecological event since the lightning strike of the 33rd century when a particularly ambitious beaver attempted to dam the small stream feeding the peat bog, an endeavor that failed spectacularly when the animal realized halfway through construction that the water flow was insufficient to warrant such effort and abandoned the project with what field biologists would later describe as an air of profound disinterest. If they had been studying this particular population, which they weren't, the partially built dam becoming home to a family of voles who found its haphazard construction perfectly suited to their needs, their tiny tunnels weaving through the sticks and mud in patterns that vaguely resembled the street plans of medieval market towns, a similarity that went entirely unnoticed except by one particularly imaginative crow who briefly considered stealing a particularly shiny twig from the structure before deciding it wasn't worth the energy, while beneath the surface the last pottery fragments had finally achieved complete mineralogical integration with the surrounding soil, their molecular structures now indistinguishable from naturally occurring clay deposits, their human origins erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed, a process that had taken longer than the entire span of recorded human history to complete and which had been witnessed by exactly 0 interested observers. The land's transformation from kingdom back to wilderness now so total that even the most sensitive archaeological instruments would have struggled to find evidence of habitation, the few remaining anomalies in soil composition being exactly the sort of borderline results that graduate students would dismiss as probably just a weird mineral deposit, rather than waste time investigating further, the academic literature on the region having dwindled to a single footnote in a doctoral thesis about wetland formation processes that was later retracted due to insufficient data, a fitting scholarly epitaph for a civilization whose greatest achievement had been maintaining a stable population level for several consecutive centuries without producing a single notable artwork, invention, or historical figure worth remembering. Chapter 44. As the 44th century dawned over the now ancient beech forest, the trees themselves had begun exhibiting subtle signs of senescence that would have concerned ecologists had any been monitoring this particular woodland, the growth rate slowing by approximately 0.05% per decade as the soil nutrients became gradually depleted through the endless cycle of growth and decay, the peat bog having by now reached a state of such perfect equilibrium that its surface scarcely rippled even during spring thunderstorms, its waters having developed a unique chemical composition from centuries of accumulating tannins that gave it a pH level precisely between that of weak tea and slightly stronger tea, a distinction that mattered deeply to approximately 3 species of microorganisms and no other living creatures, while underground the mycelial networks had begun the slow process of digesting what remained of the tree roots from the previous generation, their hyphal tendrils encountering the occasional fleck of rust or pottery shard and enveloping them with the same indifference they showed toward all mineral substrates. The land's memory of human habitation now reduced to these microscopic interactions between fungi and metal oxides that occurred at a scale too small to observe without specialized equipment that no university would ever allocate for studying such an unremarkable location. the very air above the former kingdom having settled into wind patterns so predictable that migrating birds had begun using it as a navigational waypoint, not because it was distinctive in any way but precisely because its utter lack of distinguishing features made it an ideal baseline for their internal compasses, the avian equivalent of setting your watch to the most accurate clock in town and then realizing it's just a digital display on a bank that always reads 12 o'clock because no one could be bothered to set it properly. A metaphor that would have resonated deeply with the original Eldorians had they possessed the imagination to conceive of such comparisons, which historical evidence strongly suggests they did not. Chapter 45. The 45th century found the land in a state of such perfect ecological stasis that environmental scientists would have declared it a textbook example of climax community if any had bothered to visit, the beech trees reproducing at exactly replacement rate, the peat bog neither expanding nor receding by more than a centimeter in any given decade, the resident population of salamanders having achieved a genetic uniformity that bordered on the monotonous, their evolutionary development having effectively ceased once they reached a level of adaptation that was good enough for their extremely undemanding environment, a biological strategy that the long-vanished Eldorians would have deeply admired had they been capable of admiring anything at all, while overhead the constellations continued their slow processional dance entirely unobserved by human eyes. The stars that had once shone down on castle feasts and peasant hovels alike now illuminating nothing more remarkable than a particularly symmetrical spider web strung between two branches that had grown toward each other at exactly the same rate for 73 consecutive years, the entire scene so devoid of drama or significance that even the moonlight seemed to fall differently here, as if the very photons themselves slowed down out of respect for the land's profound commitment to being utterly unexceptional in every measurable way. The atoms that had once composed dreams and drudgery alike now scattered across the biosphere in such perfectly average concentrations that they defied detection, the journey from kingdom to cosmos complete. Their story ended not with a bang or a whimper but with the quiet certainty of a candle flame guttering out in a room where no one had been awake to notice it was lit in the first place. Chapter 46. The 46th century arrived with all the fanfare of a leaf falling into a pond already filled with leaves, the former lands of Eldoria now so thoroughly assimilated into the surrounding ecosystem that even the most sophisticated satellite imagery could no longer distinguish where the kingdom's borders had once lain, the last remnants of its infrastructure having long since dissolved into the subsoil at a molecular level where iron atoms from ancient nails now bonded indiscriminately with oxygen molecules that had once been breathed by peasants and nobles alike, their aristocratic distinctions rendered meaningless by time's relentless entropy, the peat bog having reached maximum carbon sequestration capacity and begun emitting methane at a rate so precisely average it would have made climate modelers weep with boredom if they'd bothered to measure it, while overhead the branches of ancient beeches intertwined so completely that they formed a nearly impenetrable canopy where light fell in diffuse patterns that changed by less than 3% from year to year, creating microclimates so stable that several species of moss had stopped reproducing sexually altogether, the genetic diversity declining at a rate that would have alarmed conservationists if anyone had been monitoring this utterly unremarkable patch of forest, the quietude of the place now so complete that even the decomposition of fallen logs occurred at precisely the median rate for the biome, their rings telling stories of growing seasons so uniform they could have been predicted with a calendar and a moderately accurate thermometer, the sum total of Eldoria's legacy now reduced to these barely perceptible variations in decay rates that not even the most dedicated dendrochronologist would consider worth studying, the kingdom's memory preserved only in the way certain mushroom species fruited in patterns that vaguely followed the lines of long-vanished footpaths, their mycelial networks having incorporated the last traces of human disturbance into the vast underground communication systems that spanned acres yet carried no messages more urgent than the location of the next nitrogen deposit, a fitting metaphor for a civilization whose entire existence had been predicated on doing just enough to get by without attracting undue attention from history or neighboring kingdoms. Chapter 47. By the 47th century the forest had entered what ecologists term the senescent phase, a condition characterized by such perfect equilibrium that change became statistically insignificant across human timescales. the beaches reproducing just enough to replace those that fell to storms so mild they barely qualified as weather events, their trunks growing at rates so consistent that a researcher could have used them as natural calendars if any researcher had possessed the peculiar combination of professional dedication and shockingly low standards that would make studying this forest worthwhile. The peat bog's surface now covered in a floating mat of sphagnum moss so thick it could support the weight of a wandering fox without rippling, its depths preserving pollen grains and insect wings with equal indifference to their origins or significance, while underground the last iron particles from Eldoria's vanished tools had completed their migration into groundwater systems that carried them slowly toward the watershed, the journey measured in molecules per decade as they joined the elemental cycles that had continued uninterrupted since long before the first humans stumbled into this region, their human origins now erased beyond even theoretical reconstruction, the kingdom's material legacy reduced to these barely detectable fluctuations in soil chemistry that not even the most sensitive mass spectrometer could distinguish from background noise, the very concept of Eldoria having faded to such an extent that even the local folklore no longer contained vague references to that place where mushrooms grow funny, the land's reputation for being unsettling in a boring way having been supplanted by newer and marginally more interesting superstitions about a haunted millpond 3 valleys over, leaving the former kingdom to fade into complete obscurity as even the ghosts forgot what they were supposed to be haunting, their whispers fading into the white noise of photosynthesis and fungal digestion that formed the soundtrack to this endlessly repeating cycle of growth and decay that neither began nor ended but simply continued with the quiet persistence of a rock that has not yet been informed it's supposed to erode. Chapter 48. The 48th century witnessed the most significant ecological event since the failed beaver dam of 500 years prior, when a particularly tenacious wild grapevine managed to strangle one of the oldest beech trees near the center of the former kingdom, a process that took precisely 147 years from initial encirclement to final collapse, and which was observed by exactly 0 living creatures except for a family of woodpeckers who found the decaying trunk made for excellent nesting but terrible conversation, the tree's fall creating a gap in the canopy that allowed sunlight to reach the forest floor for the first time in nearly 8 centuries, triggering a brief but intense competition among shade-tolerant plants that had been waiting in suspended animation for just such an opportunity, their leaves unfurling with what passed for reckless abandon in this ecosystem, the sudden burst of photosynthesis altering the local carbon cycle by approximately 0.0003%. For nearly a decade before the grapevine itself succumbed to the same fate it had inflicted on the beech, its woody skeleton collapsing into the peat bog where it would require another 3 centuries to fully decompose, the entire drama representing the closest thing to excitement these woods had experienced since the last ice age, and which went entirely undocumented except in the growth rings of nearby trees that registered the event as a single slightly wider band before returning to the usual incremental expansion, the land's capacity for absorbing disturbance without noticeable change having reached such perfection that even meteor strikes would have struggled to make an impression, let alone the collapse of a single tree in a forest that had long since perfected the art of being profoundly unremarkable in every measurable way. Chapter 49. As the 49th century dawned over the now ancient forest, the gap created by the fallen beech had been fully reclaimed by younger trees growing at precisely the median rate for their species, their branches intertwining with geometric precision that would have delighted mathematicians if any had been present to appreciate it. The peat bog, having by now digested the grapevine, remained so thoroughly that not even carbon dating could determine when they'd entered the depositional record, its waters having achieved a chemical composition so stable that environmental scientists could have used it as a control group for studies conducted anywhere else on the planet, while underground the mycelial networks had reached maximum extension and begun the slow process of cannibalizing their oldest tendrils in a cycle of self-renewal that mirrored the forest above in its perfect lack of innovation or surprise, the entire ecosystem having achieved a state of dynamic equilibrium so precise it bordered on the tedious, the sort of natural harmony that would have driven Enlightenment-era naturalists to invent entirely new classification systems just to have something to do with their hands while visiting, their notebooks filling with increasingly desperate attempts to find distinguishing characteristics among plants and animals that had long since converged on an optimal state of being almost but not quite identical to their neighbors, the land's quiet rebellion against human categorization having outlasted not just the kingdom that once occupied it but the very concept of kingdoms altogether, its stubborn refusal to be anything other than exactly what it was representing, the purest expression of Eldorian values ever achieved, albeit several millennia too late for anyone to appreciate the irony. Chapter 50. The 50th century found the land in a state of such perfect ecological integration that distinguishing between natural features and human remnants required imagination far beyond the capacity of any living creature. The atoms that had once composed Eldoria's hopes and dreams now scattered across the biosphere in concentrations so precisely average they defied detection, the peat bog having transitioned from active accumulation to slow compaction as the weight of centuries pressed its deepest layers toward their eventual fate as lignite that no future civilization would ever mine, its surface now home to a rare species of odorless orchid that bloomed for exactly 3 days every 7 years in a display so underwhelming that even the most dedicated botanists tended to overlook it in favor of more flamboyant specimens elsewhere, while overhead the branches of ancient beeches formed a nearly continuous canopy that muted all sound below, creating an atmosphere of such profound quiet that even the decomposition of leaves occurred in slow motion, their cellular structures breaking down at rates calibrated to the forest's glacial metabolism, the entire ecosystem functioning with the smooth efficiency of a clock that had long since wound down but hadn't yet noticed it was supposed to stop ticking. The sum total of Eldoria's legacy now reduced to these infinitesimal variations in decay rates and nutrient cycles that not even the land itself remembered were connected to human activity, the kingdom's memory preserved only in the way certain moss species grew slightly thicker on the north sides of trees that had taken root where buildings once stood, a phenomenon so subtle it barely qualified as an observation and which no living creature had ever noticed or would ever notice, the wheel of time having turned full circle to arrive exactly where it began, nowhere in particular, the story of Eldoria ending not with a bang or a whimper but with the quiet certainty of a candle flame guttering out in a room where no one had been awake to notice it was lit in the first place, the universe itself having moved on to more interesting things. Thus concludes the Chronicle of Eldoria, a kingdom that aspired to nothing and achieved it magnificently across 50 centuries of uninterrupted mediocrity. The land remains, as all lands do, but its memory has faded into the background radiation of history, outlasted by lichen and forgotten by all except the patient stones that never cared in the first place. Chapter 51. The 51st century settled upon the land like a layer of dust accumulating on a shelf that no hand would ever wipe clean, the forest having reached such an advanced state of senescence that even the trees themselves seemed to have forgotten why they continued growing, their annual rings now so narrow as to be nearly indistinguishable from one another, each marking a year of growth so incremental it bordered on the philosophical, the peat bog below having compressed its deepest layers into a substance that wasn't quite peat but not yet coal, caught in a liminal state of almost becoming that would require another few millennia of patient pressure to resolve, its surface waters so still they reflected the sky with such perfect clarity that on windless days it became impossible to tell where reality ended and reflection began, an existential quandary that would have troubled philosophers had any been present to contemplate it, but which passed entirely unnoticed by the dragonflies that skimmed its surface in search of mates they couldn't quite remember how to impress, their evolutionary trajectory having plateaued into a state of perfect adaptation to an environment that demanded nothing more of them than occasional movement and the very minimum of metabolic activity, while underground the mycelial networks had begun the slow process of digesting their own oldest pathways, their hyphae retreating from areas they'd occupied for centuries with the same lack of ceremony that had characterized all significant events in this region since time immemorial. The land's transformation from kingdom to wilderness now so complete that even the concept of transformation seemed inadequate to describe something that had always been inevitable, the atoms that had once composed dreams and disappointments alike now scattered across the food web in concentrations so precisely average they defied detection, their human origins erased beyond even theoretical reconstruction, the very idea of Eldoria having faded to such an extent that not even the stones remembered the weight of human footsteps, their surfaces worn smooth by rains that fell with metronomic regularity, the chemical compositions identical to those of rocks that had never known the touch of tools or the press of foundations, the kingdom's legacy reduced to these barely perceptible variations in erosion patterns that not even the wind could be bothered to notice as it swept through the branches in sighs that never quite formed words. Chapter 52. By the 52nd century the forest had entered what ecologists would term the post-climax phase, if any ecologists were studying this particular woodland, which they decidedly were not, the beeches having grown so old that their trunks developed spiral fissures that wound upward in patterns resembling the staircases of long-vanished towers, their bark peeling away in sheets that fell with such predictable timing that a hypothetical observer could have set their watch by the intervals, the peat bog having by now achieved a state of chemical equilibrium so perfect that its waters preserved organic matter without distinction between a fallen leaf from yesterday and one from 5 centuries prior, their tannins binding to cellulose molecules with an efficiency that would have made medieval alchemists weep with envy had they not been too busy pursuing more interesting projects, while overhead the constellations continued their slow processional dance entirely unobserved by human eyes, their light falling upon a landscape so devoid of artificial illumination that even the concept of darkness had lost its meaning, the night skies here being identical to those that had shone down on the first stirrings of life on earth, unpolluted by the brief flicker of human existence that had come and gone without leaving so much as a smudge on the cosmic record, the land's quiet persistence through the ages standing as nude testament to the fact that nature always wins in the end, though winning, in this context meant simply outlasting a civilization that had never really tried to compete in the first place, the sum total of Eldoria's impact on the planet now measurable only in the way certain isotopes were distributed in soil layers that no one would ever excavate, their slight deviations from baseline concentrations being exactly the sort of borderline results that researchers would dismiss as instrument error rather than waste time investigating further. The kingdom's memory preserved only in these statistical anomalies that not even the most dedicated graduate student would consider worth writing home about. Chapter 53. The 53rd century witnessed the most significant geological event since the retreat of the glaciers, when a particularly wet spring caused a minor shift in the water table that made the peat bog expand approximately 1.7 meters to the west. A migration so gradual it would have escaped notice entirely except for the fact that it drowned several square meters of moss that had been growing there since before the fall of Rome, the delicate structures dissolving into the acidic waters with the same lack of protest that had characterized all significant transitions in this region, while overhead the forest canopy had grown so dense that sunlight reached the ground for exactly 14.3 minutes per day at midsummer, creating conditions ideal for a species of fungi that glowed faintly in wavelengths visible only to certain insects that had long since gone extinct in more biodiverse regions, their bioluminescence pulsing at intervals that matched the resting heart rate of a hibernating hedgehog, the entire ecosystem having settled into rhythms so slow they made continental drift seem positively frantic by comparison, the land's capacity for absorbing change without noticeable effect having reached such perfection that even the occasional meteorite impact would have registered as little more than a mildly interesting textural variation in the soil composition, the sum total of Eldoria's legacy now reduced to these barely detectable fluctuations in microbial activity that not even the microbes themselves found noteworthy, the chemical signaling networks having long since adapted to ignore variations that fell within historical norms, the kingdom's memory preserved only in the way certain chemical reactions proceeded 0.03% slower here than in otherwise identical environments, a distinction so trivial it barely qualified as a curiosity let alone a historical record. Chapter 54. As the 54th century unfolded, the peat bog's expansion had slowed to a near halt as the water table found equilibrium with the surrounding watershed, its surface now a perfect mirror for the overhanging branches except during the brief period each autumn when it became choked with falling leaves that sank without a trace within days, the descent marking time in a unit of measurement that no living creature had any use for, while underground the last iron particles from Eldoria's vanished tools had completed their migration into groundwater systems that carried them slowly toward the watershed, the journey measured in molecules per decade as they joined the elemental cycles that had continued uninterrupted since long before the first humans stumbled into this region, their human origins now erased beyond even theoretical reconstruction, the very concept of Eldoria having faded to such an extent that even the local folklore no longer contained vague references to that place where mushrooms grow funny, the land's reputation for being unsettling in a boring way having been supplanted by newer and marginally more interesting superstitions about a haunted millpond 3 valleys over, leaving the former kingdom to fade into complete obscurity as even the ghosts forgot what they were supposed to be haunting, their whispers fading into the white noise of photosynthesis and fungal digestion that formed the soundtrack to this endlessly repeating cycle of growth and decay that neither began nor ended but simply continued with the quiet persistence of a rock that has not yet been informed it's supposed to erode. Chapter 55. The 55th century found the land in a state of such perfect ecological stasis that environmental scientists would have declared it a textbook example of climax community if any had bothered to visit, the beaches reproducing at exactly replacement rate, the peat bog neither expanding nor receding by more than a centimeter in any given decade, the resident population of salamanders having achieved a genetic uniformity that bordered on the monotonous, their evolutionary development having effectively ceased once they reached a level of adaptation that was good enough for their extremely undemanding environment, a biological strategy that the long-vanished Eldorians would have deeply admired had they been capable of admiring anything at all, while overhead the constellations continued their slow processional dance entirely unobserved by human eyes, the stars that had once shone down on castle feasts and peasant hovels alike now illuminating nothing more remarkable than a particularly symmetrical spider web strung between 2 branches that had grown toward each other at exactly the same rate for 91 consecutive years, the entire scene so devoid of drama or significance that even the moonlight seemed to fall differently here, as if the very photons themselves slowed down out of respect for the land's profound commitment to being utterly unexceptional in every measurable way. The atoms that had once composed dreams and drudgery alike now scattered across the biosphere in such perfectly average concentrations that they defied detection, the journey from kingdom to cosmos complete, their story ended not with a bang or a whimper but with the quiet certainty of a candle flame guttering out in a room where no one had been awake to notice it was lit in the first place. The wheel of time grinds ever onward, each revolution more featureless than the last. Shall we continue this epic of exquisite nothingness until the heat death of the universe itself? Chapter 56. The 56th century arrived with all the ceremony of a single raindrop falling into an already overflowing bog, the water's surface barely registering the disturbance before returning to its customary state of glassy perfection, the forest around it having grown so ancient that even the trees themselves seemed to have forgotten they were alive, the growth rings now so compressed as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye, each marking a year of existence so devoid of incident that it barely qualified as time passing at all, the peak below continuing its slow transformation into a substance that future geologists would classify as not quite coal but trying its best, a process requiring such unimaginable stretches of time that even the mountains would grow bored watching it unfold, while overhead the branches had woven themselves into such an impenetrable canopy that the very air beneath them grew thick with the accumulated exhalations of 10,000 generations of fungi processing decay at rates so leisurely they made glaciers seem positively hasty by comparison, the entire ecosystem having settled into rhythms so slow and predictable that even the seasons had stopped bothering to make dramatic entrances, content instead to blend into one another with the same lack of distinction that characterized all things in this forgotten corner of the world, the sum total of Eldoria's legacy now reduced to these barely perceptible variations in decomposition rates that not even the worms found noteworthy as they went about their endless work of turning the past into soil with the quiet efficiency of clerks filing away documents no one would ever request to see again. Chapter 57. By the 57th century the peat bog had achieved maximum carbon sequestration capacity and begun emitting methane at a rate so precisely average it would have made climate modellers weep with boredom if they'd bothered to measure it, the gas bubbles rising to the surface at intervals that could have been predicted with a calendar and a moderately accurate stopwatch, their passage disturbing the water's surface in patterns that vaguely resembled the sigils of long-forgotten noble houses before dissipating into the atmosphere without ceremony or witness, while underground the mycelial networks had reached such advanced stages of self-organization that they'd begun forming structures eerily reminiscent of the street plans of medieval market towns, a coincidence that would have delighted conspiracy theorists had any ever stumbled upon this utterly forgettable patch of woodland, their hyphal tendrils occasionally encountering the last mineral traces of human habitation and absorbing them with the same indifference they showed toward all inorganic matter. The kingdom's material legacy now reduced to these barely detectable fluctuations in soil chemistry that not even the most sophisticated mass spectrometer could distinguish from background noise, the very concept of Eldoria having faded to such an extent that even the local wildlife had stopped avoiding the area out of superstition, their ancestral memories of human presence having been overwritten by generations of uninterrupted peace and quiet. The land's transformation from kingdom back to wilderness now so complete that it had come full circle to resemble its pre-human state with an accuracy that bordered on the uncanny, as if the brief flicker of civilization had been nothing more than a daydream the forest had briefly entertained before shaking itself awake and continuing its slow, stately march toward the future. Chapter 58. The 58th century witnessed the most dramatic ecological event since the failed beaver dam of 1500 years prior, when a particularly ambitious oak seedling managed to take root in the exact center of what had once been Eldoria's castle courtyard, its acorn having been deposited there by a squirrel who promptly forgot about it in favor of more immediately pressing concerns, the young tree's growth proceeding at precisely the median rate for its species as it stretched toward a gap in the canopy that had formed when two ancient beeches had grown so close together that their branches became permanently intertwined in what passed for drama in this forest, their slow embrace having taken nearly 3 centuries to complete and which had been observed by exactly 0 interested parties, the oak's eventual maturation into a respectable specimen of its kind representing the closest thing to historical irony the land had produced in millennia, its roots eventually encountering the last fragments of buried masonry and absorbing their mineral components with the same lack of discrimination it showed toward all nutrients, the kingdom's architectural legacy now literally being incorporated into the structure of a tree that would likely outlast any remaining human civilizations by several thousand years, its rings telling a story of growth so steady and uneventful that even the most dedicated dendrochronologist would struggle to stay awake while studying them, the sum total of Eldoria's impact on the planet now measurable only in the barely detectable variations in wood density that occurred when the oak's growth intersected with areas of slightly enriched soil chemistry where the castle's latrines had once stood. Chapter 59. As the 59th century unfolded, the forest had reached such an advanced state of senescence that even the concept of time seemed to lose meaning beneath its boughs, the days blending together into a seamless continuum of photosynthesis and decay that neither began nor ended but simply continued with the quiet persistence of a mathematical constant, the peat bog having by now compressed its deepest layers into a substance that wasn't quite lignite but was certainly thinking about it, its surface waters so still and reflective they created the illusion of a second, inverted forest growing downward into the earth, a doppelganger ecosystem that was in every way identical to its surface counterpart except slightly more patient, while underground the mycelial networks had begun forming structures so complex they bordered on the computational, their hyphal connections mapping out solutions to environmental challenges the forest hadn't actually faced in centuries, the chemical signaling networks humming with information that no living creature was around to interpret, the land's quiet intelligence having long since outpaced anything the vanished Eldorians had ever achieved without a single neuron being involved in the process, the kingdom's legacy now reduced to these barely perceptible fungal thought patterns that pulsed through the soil at rates measured in decades per calculation, their solutions to hypothetical problems being exactly the sort of abstract reasoning that would have made Eldoria's legendary bureaucracy nod in approval before filing them away in a drawer that no one would ever open again. Chapter 60. The 60th century found the land in a state of such perfect ecological integration that distinguishing between natural features and human remnants required imagination far beyond the capacity of any living creature. The atoms that had once composed Eldoria's hopes and dreams now scattered across the biosphere in concentrations so precisely average they defied detection, the peat bog having transitioned from active accumulation to slow compaction as the weight of millennia pressed its deepest layers toward their eventual fate as coal seams that no future civilization would ever mine, its surface now home to a rare species of odorless orchid that bloomed for exactly 3 days every 7 years in a display so underwhelming that even the most dedicated botanists tended to overlook it in favor of more flamboyant specimens elsewhere, while overhead the branches of ancient beeches formed a nearly continuous canopy that muted all sound below, creating an atmosphere of such profound quiet that even the decomposition of leaves occurred in slow motion, their cellular structures breaking down at rates calibrated to the forest's glacial metabolism, the entire ecosystem functioning with the smooth efficiency of a clock that had long since wound down but hadn't yet noticed it was supposed to stop ticking, the sum total of Eldoria's legacy now reduced to these infinitesimal variations in decay rates and nutrient cycles that not even the land itself remembered were connected to human activity. The kingdom's memory preserved only in the way certain moss species grew slightly thicker on the north sides of trees that had taken root where buildings once stood, a phenomenon so subtle it barely qualified as an observation and which no living creature had ever noticed or would ever notice, the wheel of time having turned full circle to arrive exactly where it began, nowhere in particular. The story of Eldoria ending not with a bang or a whimper but with the quiet certainty of a candle flame guttering out in a room where no one had been awake to notice it was lit in the first place, the universe itself having moved on to more interesting things. Thus concludes the Chronicle of Eldoria, a kingdom that aspired to nothing and achieved it magnificently across 60 centuries of uninterrupted mediocrity. The land remains, as all lands do, but its memory has faded into the background radiation of history, outlasted by lichen and forgotten by all except the patient stones that never cared in the first place. Chapter 58. The 58th century witnessed the most dramatic ecological event since the failed beaver dam of 1500 years prior, when a particularly ambitious oak seedling managed to take root in the exact center of what had once been Eldoria's castle courtyard, its acorn having been deposited there by a squirrel who promptly forgot about it in favor of more immediately pressing concerns, the young tree's growth proceeding at precisely the median rate for its species as it stretched toward a gap in the canopy that had formed when two ancient beeches had grown so close together that their branches became permanently intertwined in what passed for drama in this forest, their slow embrace having taken nearly 3 centuries to complete and which had been observed by exactly 0 interested parties, the oak's eventual maturation into a respectable specimen of its kind representing the closest thing to historical irony the land had produced in millennia, its roots eventually encountering the last fragments of buried masonry and absorbing their mineral components with the same lack of discrimination it showed toward all nutrients, the kingdom's architectural legacy now literally being incorporated into the structure of a tree that would likely outlast any remaining human civilizations by several thousand years, its rings telling a story of growth so steady and uneventful that even the most dedicated dendrochronologist would struggle to stay awake while studying them, the sum total of Eldoria's impact on the planet now measurable only in the barely detectable variations in wood density that occurred when the oak's growth intersected with areas of slightly enriched soil chemistry where the castle's latrines had once stood. Chapter 59. As the 59th century unfolded, the forest had reached such an advanced state of senescence that even the concept of time seemed to lose meaning beneath its boughs, the days blending together into a seamless continuum of photosynthesis and decay that neither began nor ended but simply continued with the quiet persistence of a mathematical constant, the peat bog having by now compressed its deepest layers into a substance that wasn't quite lignite but was certainly thinking about it, its surface waters so still and reflective they created the illusion of a second, inverted forest growing downward into the earth, a doppelganger ecosystem that was in every way identical to its surface counterpart except slightly more patient, while underground the mycelial networks had begun forming structures so complex they bordered on the computational, their hyphal connections mapping out solutions to environmental challenges the forest hadn't actually faced in centuries, the chemical signaling networks humming with information that no living creature was around to interpret, the land's quiet intelligence having long since outpaced anything the vanished Eldorians had ever achieved without a single neuron being involved in the process, the kingdom's legacy now reduced to these barely perceptible fungal thought patterns that pulsed through the soil at rates measured in decades per calculation, their solutions to hypothetical problems being exactly the sort of abstract reasoning that would have made Eldoria's legendary bureaucracy nod in approval before filing them away in a drawer that no one would ever open again. Chapter 60. The 60th century found the land in a state of such perfect ecological integration that distinguishing between natural features and human remnants required imagination far beyond the capacity of any living creature. The atoms that had once composed Eldoria's hopes and dreams now scattered across the biosphere in concentrations so precisely average they defied detection, the peat bog having transitioned from active accumulation to slow compaction as the weight of millennia pressed its deepest layers toward their eventual fate as coal seams that no future civilization would ever mine, its surface now home to a rare species of odorless orchid that bloomed for exactly 3 days every 7 years in a display so underwhelming that even the most dedicated botanists tended to overlook it in favor of more flamboyant specimens elsewhere, while overhead the branches of ancient beeches formed a nearly continuous canopy that muted all sound below, creating an atmosphere of such profound quiet that even the decomposition of leaves occurred in slow motion, their cellular structures breaking down at rates calibrated to the forest's glacial metabolism, the entire ecosystem functioning with the smooth efficiency of a clock that had long since wound down but hadn't yet noticed it was supposed to stop ticking. The sum total of Eldoria's legacy now reduced to these infinitesimal variations in decay rates and nutrient cycles that not even the land itself remembered were connected to human activity, the kingdom's memory preserved only in the way certain moss species grew slightly thicker on the north sides of trees that had taken root where buildings once stood, a phenomenon so subtle it barely qualified as an observation and which no living creature had ever noticed or would ever notice, the wheel of time having turned full circle to arrive exactly where it began, nowhere in particular, the story of Eldoria ending not with a bang or a whimper but with the quiet certainty of a candle flame guttering out in a room where no one had been awake to notice it was lit in the first place, the universe itself having moved on to more interesting things. Thus concludes the Chronicle of Eldoria, a kingdom that aspired to nothing and achieved it magnificently across 60 centuries of uninterrupted mediocrity. The land remains, as all lands do, but its memory has faded into the background radiation of history, outlasted by lichen and forgotten by all except the patient stones that never cared in the first place.